Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Sermon Podcast for the Community Church for GOD. My name is Mitchell Buchanan. I'm here with you most every week, which is fantastic. I love it. To my right, your left, Benjamin Reese.
Hey, everyone.
Such a gentleman. On my left, your right, Laurie Kagay.
Hi, everyone.
Both of these people are generous enough to, I think, preach on Sundays. They're both on faculty for the Institute, know God's Word incredibly well, and I think had some really great sermons on generosity, which is what we're going to be walking through today, which a lot of those, I think, highlighted interesting things we wouldn't necessarily connect with. You're supposed to give. Where do we give? I'll put it in the box. Like, I think considerations we're making individually, I think hopes that we would have for our like church body overall. But I had a great time prepping for this and re-listening to sermons. And let's chat about the Bible. Is that cool?
That sounds good. Yeah.
How good does it sound, Ben?
Sounds very good. Yeah. Yeah, I think it sounds
I wanted
great.
the Tove me ode there, and how good it was.
Yeah, very good.
That's great. So generally what we'll do is we'll kind of kick off what our passages were, just to remind us all. If Ben and Laurie want to share like a nugget or like an inspiration or the main point they had for the sermon, and then we'll just kind of chop it up and chat. How does the Bible inform us and how we're supposed to live with generosity? Yeah. So Laurie, you want to go first?
Sure. So I preached on 2 Corinthians 8. I think this one says 1 through 5, but I think I did a few more verses than that. But these chapters 8 and 9 are really Paul's main and longest communication regarding the task for believers to give. So he gives his longest exposition on giving to the Corinthians in this book. So that is kind of go-to as far as generosity. There's a lot in there, so I did some of the first verses in context. The idea of cheerful giver comes up in the next chapter. But before that, this is like his introduction. Like, hey, I am coming. And you've told me there's going to be a gift. Here's how I want you to give it. He talks a lot about the grace of giving, that it is a gift to us. One of my points was that giving begins by giving yourself to God and then letting him align your heart with that task. He also gives them some challenging words on like, you're excelling in wisdom and understanding and these other things, but you also have to excel in the grace of giving. Is his communication to them. And he also tells them that timeliness matters. So he is like, you've been saying you're giving it. I'm coming. Don't let me down. So there is an expectation not only to give, but to give with some timeliness, which for us as a church, I think December is kind of that month of remembering the poor in many ways and remembering our task. And so, timeliness felt right for that time of year for us as a body. So that'd be a short recap.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think I liked how you reiterated a couple. You use fundraising even a few times in your sermon where it's like, you've been, I think, kind of that voice of like, we have this campaign coming up, like you all get ready. And it's like, seeing this in Paul's vision of like, hey, I'm like fundraising for ministry, where I think fundraising, we just have like the giant thermometer we're like filling in, and it feels like, how many coupon books do I have to sell to get 1 minute in the money machine? Like it feels like you're balancing like expectations with like incentive, where, Paul's fundraising is like, there's people in need. Like this is like, there's nothing to be shy about like fundraising for like the good work God is doing. And like, I just wanted to like, that piqued my interest, even re-listening to it and then the sermon of like, yeah, this is like you're like, fundraising isn't easy. Like Paul's dedicating 2 chapters to like how we have to fundraise. And it's like, I think a lot of times either we have the presumption that like, oh, if we create the link and post it up, it'll just happen. Or, that's, Laurie's gig. She's making it happen. Right. And it's like,
Please
hey,
no.
There's... All right, the whole rest of the podcast, like, that is never the case. Like, clear your minds. But, the attention Paul gave to, like, how this is supposed to happen isn't just important in, like, theologically, but pragmatically. Like, I need this soon, guys. Like, it's like the timeliness, like, those pragmatic
I think
things.
it's something we don't think about Paul,
Right.
We think about him as a teacher. We think about him as a missionary. But a big part of his letters is raising this offering. Like it was a major concern for him, a lot of time, a lot of effort. He was raising funds for this particular task. So it's part of our vocation. And Paul I think that's what we can do. It's not just like an add-on. Hey, it'd be nice if we have this gift. Like Paul is being an example to us, even of apostolic mission in the raising of funds. So,
yeah. Fun fact, I was a student of Laurie, and I took Paul the Apostle with her, and she was a teacher. Great class, but I do remember writing a paper on 2 Corinthians that really impacted me because I wrote about the emotions of Paul, and it was a time when I realized, people who serve God have emotions, and Paul's very...
I'm sorry, that's when you realized?
That is a big realization for a lot of students.
Or at least should have emotions. I don't know, But if you grew up in the church, a lot of the people of God who are representing to you what Christianity looks like has a very sort of stoic patina on it. Okay. Just like these, good people, but they just don't show. You don't see much emotion in, at least within the denominations that I grew up in. So writing that paper,
if there is emotion, it might be because they're confessing sin.
Right, it might be bad.
Remorse and no other. That's the only emotion.
But I remember writing that paper, just tracking how Paul's nervous. There's just a lot of emotions in that letter, and I remember that making quite an impact on me. And you see those emotions come out over in this passage that Laurie, and I think she captured it well in her sermon, just he's saying don't think this, but also you need to do it, but also there's a lot of, he seems very cautious in communicating this message to them, and he has a lot of emotions because he doesn't want to be perceived wrongly.
Right.
And he wants to come across clearly and to make demands while also making sure that he's not twisting their arms.
Yeah,
is a delicate task.
It's a delicate.
Actually, when I was preparing for this sermon, task. I was telling Ben this before I went up, but I was reading something from N.T. Wright, and he was like, the Greek of this passage is very tortured. Even as awesome as Paul is, this seems to have been a hard task even for him to present and ask and do it without, I think that's part of the struggle even in Corinthians is they weren't always sure about Paul or his motives. There was some contention there, but he's still going to ask them for money. So there's some torture. So I try to deliver on that too when I gave the sermon.
Yeah, you did.
No, I mean after the sermon, all my kids said to me was, "Mom, you got really red." So
I love that the report that you get from people who love you, you looked really weird up there, Mom.
That's my favorite.
But it's true. I was impacted by the sermon because I work closely with Laurie. And when you're in sort of leadership and you see the whole fundraising from the inside, it's a tough thing because you're relying on these funds. You need them. You know the good work that you need to do. And you want people to be blessed by participating in the work that God wants to do. But also then people can look at you like you're some sort of, I don't know, slick, trying to just make money charlatan. It's very easy to come off as that. And that's obviously the last thing you want to do.
Right.
So it really puts you in a tough spot where you're I want to push because I know it's going to be good. And I know we need these funds and we need to get people on board. But also I don't want them to feel coming on the other end of that experience than being they forced me to, and that's tricky. Right. I dislike fundraising so much. And I sit across from Laurie seeing her do it. And I'm thank God for Laurie, because that's a lot of pressure. And I think Paul feels that pressure in this passage. So knowing Laurie and knowing that passage, it was really good sermon. I think people could benefit.
From Laurie's sermon, it's something I mentioned and she gave an amen. It shouldn't just be relegated to Laurie. We should all feel that tension and pressure of properly reflecting the ministry God has us in, where he's guiding our church, and where it's a righteous fundraising effort. It's a righteous call to give when it's hey, I know these people in the Philippines. I know these people in Uganda, like met them. My wife Zooms with them on class. It's like we want to help them.
Yeah.
And it's like in a purity of heart, like, can you help support this? So it's like, and nobody wants like either the awkward disposition or like, hey, we all feel, I think not the weight, but we all feel the awkwardness of like, I try to keep in touch with you, but it's really 3 times a year. And it's like, here's one of the 3.
Right.
Can you like help support this?
Right.
Where you want to basically have like this perfect foundation when you're approaching someone of like, how's your kid? Send me some pictures, like all these touch points. And it's like, I think there's probably some logistical lessons we could learn and like, hey, how do we connect with people that invites them into like these good opportunities God has, and not just like, squeezing every last like possible, source of funds. Because I think there's a balance there. But overall, I started saying this of like, we should all feel that tension and pressure and awkwardness of like, hey, it's not just we need to hit a certain measure on a thermometer, but it's like, I should be compelled by my faith and like how God's doing in our ministry to make those like requests. And it's like, how do I do it in a way where I'm not like just the next person in line asking for money, but it's like, I'm doing it as someone that is connected to the Lord.
Yeah. I think that's important. You have to give people a narrative. Like you have to allow people to step into a narrative where they understand why they're giving. And on the other end of that, they can give praise to God, which is what Paul ultimately wants. He wants them to be able to tell a story of their generosity in a way that honors God. And we can help people do that. Like, and that's what Laurie does in her job. It's like, hey, this is, you can give, and this is what this means, so that they understand the significance of it, so that when they're talking about giving, they can be like, yeah, I got to give. I had the great opportunity to give towards this.
Yeah.
And not just like, I don't know, I got pestered and I just,
gave in
and I just, to get them off my back.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
well, as a segue, because I think there's a lot from both your sermons that really complement one another. If you want to give the passage you spoke from, which is kind of something that I wouldn't directly connect, like, sacrifice in Israel with like the giving generosity season, but it's the foundation for even how God sees giving. And like, we can draw a lot of connections to even Paul's theology and mentality in Corinthians. So if you want to give like your talk, like the passage that you spoke from, and then a couple of main points or inspiration or whatever you want to.
Sure. Yeah. There was a few passages. So I'd say I spoke more on an idea, which is the free will gift offering, which is found in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and there's some mentions of it other places, but mostly Deuteronomy 12:17-18 was a key passage if people want to kind of have a passage to be anchored to. And I was sort of interested in kind of like this tension within the Old Testament of like, there's places in the Old Testament where God asks for giving and requires giving of his people. And there's places in the Old Testament, specifically in the prophets, where he's like, I don't like your giving. You should stop it. And I'm annoyed by it. And so I wanted to really explore that. That was sort of the problem that interested me. And then, so in studying the free will gift offering, I wanted to communicate that there was an approach that God wanted his people to take so that giving was done correctly in a way that represented who God was correctly, and that he wasn't this tyrannical person that was just sapping them of resources, which is the kind of the kingly image of that they would have been used to in the culture around them. And instead, God wanted to have them be able to communicate that this is a representation of the benefit and the goodness of God in their lives, and giving them an opportunity to actually proclaim that goodness and to give praise to God. And so that was that idea that God had in the free will gift offering, which was gift giving in the Old Testament, he had certain regulations in place to ensure that Israel was giving correctly in a way that honored him.
Yeah. Which you both I think, highlighted, and maybe you could expound more, because we're effectively saying, hey, if you come in with a spirit or an attitude of like, I'll begrudgingly give, or like, I'm annoyed to the point where I'll finally donate something. If we don't have a heart centered on, I think, like cheerfulness or like an eagerness to give, I think is how Laurie really said it, that we're missing the mark on what God expects from us, or that ruins the whole process altogether, where God's like, hey, I actually hate, this is worse than, not giving at all, because like,
Right.
what you're saying, that's kind of like later in the prophets is what's encapsulated. Which, thinking through that, I was just like, really, I would love your all's perspective, because I just started thinking of like, in times where I'm giving, like, where do I get in my attitude where I'm like, I guess I'll donate, or I guess I'll give. And I think it came down to, most of the time, I think people in our church can concede that it's better to give than receive, right? It's like, hey, we're not fighting people of like, remember, it's good to give. Like, everyone wants to be a generous person. Like, yes, I definitely will. And then I think it's fairly accepted outside of like the tithe, which we should be doing as just like a mandate. But like, hey, can you give to this special offering? Can you be generous, like above and beyond? What's like, hey, I'm literally in debt. I'm working 3 jobs. Like, I can't do it right now. I think there's like a pretty solid understanding we all have with one another. Like, hey, that totally makes sense. Like, we're not expecting people to like extend themselves to the point where they are like immediately suffering on that regard, where it's like, you may not be in a position to like give in such a above and beyond way. So like, if we were taking those as givens, where it's like, all right, I understand that. I'm trying to remember times where I've like, why have I had a bad attitude in giving? And I think I just have like, whatever the fundraising aspect is, there's just questions where I'd want, not like control on how it happens, but I just have questions that I don't feel satisfied with. I'm like, why are we doing this project? What's it for? And like, my critical side of my brain can like throw out enough either uncertainties or like things where I'm not personally satisfied, which like pushes my attitude from like cheerful to, well, I'm like crossing my arms inside of like, can you prove to me why this is good for us to do? And it's like, I don't think we should ever be at that place as a church, but I've found, over times there's moments where I feel like I've gotten there. I'm trying to like search out like why that is the case. Like, should a giver be able to have expectations on the fundraising effort to say like, hey, I need more information, or what's going on, or like, can you spell this out for me in a better way? Or is it like, hey, if we're all in one spirit together, we feel like our church acts in unison, where it's like, there's a leadership body that's like prayed through this. Hey, this is the way we want to feel led to go. Like, there should be more trust or support than to be like, you need to spell it out A to Z, and I need to report on how it's going to be spent before I give.
Well,
like, kind of the balance between expectations a giver should be able to have, or is it like, hey, we're not giving to just a human effort, you're giving to God. Like, that should be fully, like ready to participate in that way.
Well, I think there's a biblical value, or a biblical value of seeking out understanding or wisdom. And I think we should have an understanding of what we're participating in. And if you don't understand why people are asking you for money, I think that it's good to ask questions and to figure out, hey, what's this all about? I don't think you have to go in with like guns blazing, like, you guys, like, what is this all about?
You always do this.
Yeah.
What's this new thing?
I don't think you have to go in with
I think that's probably evidence, like, that there's other stuff going on
right.
On the level of trust.
And I think, at least what I tried to explore in my sermon was that one of the key regulations that God put on gift giving was to separate it in a very clear way, the gift giving from sin offerings, and having it be related to guilt at all. And I think when it comes especially to the end of the year, which in the Old Testament, the end of the year or the end of their harvest season was when the free will gift offering was almost required. It was especially sort of asked for. Is at the end of the year is when people can, when you ask for money, it can make them feel a sense of guilt about how they've spent their resources and how maybe, frankly, unconscientious they've been throughout the year about their resources, that they've just not really thought about it much. They've just been spending it or whatever it is. And so when somebody asks for money, I think there can be a sense of guilt and shame, which is something that I wanted to address in my sermon. And I think that's why some of the criticisms can come about, the negative attitudes, not the holy attitude of asking for understanding and asking questions and wanting to understand what this is going to. That's all great. But the sort of like critical, like, and I've been there where it's just like talking about money, but it's just like a guilt I feel about my own maybe lack of self-management at that time of my life. And so, and then I think some people try to overcome that guilt by saying, oh, well, I'll just give, and maybe even to their detriment. And that's just being motivated by guilt is a bad way to go about giving. You should ask for forgiveness. God will forgive you. And then you give out of what you live in reality. Like Paul says in that passage, which I really like, I think it's just an amazingly just sort of like clear-headed thing to say, which he says, like, obviously you're judged on what you have, not on what you don't have. Like, I'm not expecting you to give what you don't have.
Right.
Like, this is just reasonable. This is just a reasonable person here.
That would be insanity of like you're expected, like holding you to expectations where it's
right,
like you can't meet them.
But it's an insanity that many people participate in, which is like I feel guilty because I can't give more or whatever it is. You just put yourself into a weird state of mind where you're like, oh well, I guess this is not that much because this is all I have, and then you feel bad about the gift you're giving, and that should be the opposite. You should feel good about giving. You should give with a cheerful heart. Right. You should give joyously, as it says in Deuteronomy. And so I think there's guilt that people feel or shame people feel around resources for multiple reasons. I think that's a complicated topic, but I would say that even looking in my own life, sometimes you just want to avoid those kinds of topics because they can bring up so many different emotions in people.
Yeah.
I think the act of tithing, which is supposed to be, that regular gift, is a practice of some relinquishment of this is not a particular ask. This is a regular practice. Right. It's aligned with Sabbath. Like you Sabbath every week and you tithe every, month or whatever, like a regular practice to show I'm not my work. And God has charge in my life. Right.
In your observations, if I could ask real quick, in your observations, do you think the people that tithe regularly are also the ones that are the most likely to give that little extra at the end of the year?
I'm nodding really hard. If you're listening, I do think
I'm smashing my head on the microphone.
I do think that. I think there's just some wisdom God gives us in tithing because you are noting there's this amount. I'm giving it to God. And when you do that, it does then, okay, this is what I have left, and here's how I'm going to handle it and do it. So I think it is a regular practice. And I think that does condition us to a sense of like, I trust this gift. Like that's even like they had to give it to the priesthood, and the priesthood would do these things with it. It wasn't like, and now all of us together will go through these items and do these things. So I think that is like a practice that can condition our heart on somewhat like the trust that you're talking about.
And even just like getting us into the mind space of like, this is not my resources, this is God's.
Right. And it's a very healthy practice. So I think like on the practical level, when you're tithing, when you are giving that to God regularly, whether it's every paycheck or every month, you're getting used to that trust. Where I would imagine if it's like an ask, someone is doing a special ask or a special offering, and people are maybe not doing that, the regular tithing, then they're like, again, they're already asking me to tithe, and now this also, like. Yeah. But I agree with Ben. I think it's good to ask for understanding, but I also think it's good to ask God for understanding of your own heart in prayer.
Yeah, that kind of search me, Lord.
Yeah, like
I do think that's that.
And so if you're real hyped up, like by any kind of ask, like there's probably something going on in you that's causing you to not trust someone or to be that critical. I do like this line in 2 Corinthians because he says in verse 5, they gave themselves first to the Lord and by the will of God to us. And I just like that image. Good. That was part of, like, they give themselves to the Lord. That's the first task. And I think as a practice of generosity, that is one of the principles I wanted to say. Like, giving begins by giving yourself to the Lord. Yeah. Then, and you look at not what you don't have, but what you have.
Right.
But seeing what God does in your heart and will allow you to give.
Yeah. And I think, and seeing that, like, money and, money and God are put as these two gods in Jesus' own thinking, like you serve God or money. Yeah. It's an amazing opportunity to give yourself to the Lord and to relinquish the power that money can have to control people,
Even like in the almost like ritualistic like the practice of tithing, where it is like every month, it's a consistency. And then thinking even the Old Testament, like year of Jubilee, where it's like, hey, there's a moment in time where like this gets released, where I think those like hard stops, like the tithing every month, where it's like, hey, it should prevent the illusory control of money, where it's like, hey, this is a real tangible thing that like I can amass, or like I'll always have this, like in the bank. It's like, hey, the tithing is, I think, a reminder that it's like this is it. It's more like fungible than we'd want it to be. It's more like come and go than we'd want it, where it's like we feel like, hey, we have this in our bank account, like a drought could happen, like a fire to like your property. Like there's a lot of things that could come up where it's like, I felt like I was set and now I'm like devastated, where the practice of every month giving that to God, where it's like, hey, I can't just control all of my resources. Like there's an aspect of it where it's like my hand is always open to the Lord, where it's like I can't just count on the control I have over this finite resource, but that it's like as believers, we're like kind of trained month by month of like, okay, it comes into our account, it comes into our hands every month, but it's like our hands are always open for like, to give it to God first. Which I think is what you're talking about. Like, you either serve God or money. It's like when that's your practice of like, hey, there's hard stops on how much you actually control this. Because the first of every month, you're like, your hands are back open of like, all right, I'm giving this to God first. Where else am I investing, or where else am I giving? Like it's, retraining.
Yeah,
and that's what I liked about Ben's sermon too, because he brought up the concept of ritual and ritual as a good thing for us. And so this goodwill offering as a ritual, okay, you want to give, here is the process. I think a good challenge Ben gave was like, there was supposed to be some public nature to it, which is, I think, a challenge to us in our culture, but also that it should be accompanied with some words of testimony. And Ben and I have been talking about this recently too. I'm teaching Psalms, and he's taught it for the last several years, so we're discussing a lot as I teach it, but just the power of public testimony to be able to stand in front of people you love and be like, it's been a really good year and I'm really happy to be able to support this in this way, or I'm so proud to be a part of this church and here's some, and it doesn't always have to be like with the mic. Our new giving platform this year, like, had the ability to comment or add pictures, but I heard from a lot of people, like, they were just encouraged, like, reading through it, because there was like a space for testimony or a space for pictures to be added. And of course you could say anonymous or other things too, but like, it was ministering to people even on, even though it wasn't allowed, out loud, to see some testimony. I saw it spelled out. Yeah.
Ministry here is not allowed.
And it's that lack of connection to a narrative that seems to displease the Lord, especially in the Old Testament. Even in Micah 6, he's calling them to like, hey, speak up, like complain, like, because I think we almost treat tithing like this, even gift giving or money giving, as this sort of like dirty secret that we need to kind of, I don't know, be hush about, but there should be some attachment to words to what we do. And I think that's important. And it teaches people to count their days, teaches people to look back and reflect on what the Lord has done in their life, teaches people to connect blessing with the Lord's goodness and to take joy in when things are good, and then to also want to share that blessing with others. There's a lot of positive things that happen when we start, when we regularly get into the habit of giving to the Lord and attaching that to testimony.
Yeah.
You know?
One of my questions was, do we, along these very lines, like, do we think our natural disposition, I'm assuming just as Americans, but I think there's probably a connection just universally of, with money, that it's a personal endeavor, more personal than other things. Because are we shortchanging what God could be doing in our midst because we are either more hush hush on like how giving happens, or that we're just not as free to share or testify because it's like, I don't want to make someone else feel bad if they can't give or like rejoice in this. Like, I was impacted that way in your sermon where you kind of really said that it needs to involve an articulation from an individual of like what God is doing in your heart. And like, that's why I'm giving like this gift, or able to do this. And I'm, thinking that there's always a sensitivity when it comes to even financial like gifts in our society. Is that affecting us too negatively where it's like, hey, we're really not experiencing like the fullness God would want from our community of like rejoicing with one another, even seeing the blessing God can do in our midst, because we are like more subdued in how we approach those like testimonies or conversations?
I don't know. I think we're bad. We are bad at connecting our work with our spirituality. We're bad at recognizing, I think, drawing the lines between how God has blessed us in ways like our education, our biblical education, and how that biblical education even empowers us to work and work better, and to and so oftentimes I think we keep spirituality and like things like work separated in ways that are unhealthy. And so when it comes to the end of the year, we really feel like, oh, those resources, those are mine. I did that by my strength.
Right.
And I think if we get to the end of the year and we feel that way, we really need to take a hard look at how we're
cast some idols.
Yeah, we need to take a hard look. But I don't know what you would say, Laurie. I am interested, like, because you've observed giving. Like, what are the characteristics of like people who you're like, these people are going to give and give joyously, like in their own lives and what they do?
I think like some we have already talked about, there are certain people that are just consistent. It's like I've seen them give year over year with consistency, with gladness. There's other people that like there was someone who gave this year, and they wrote a little testimony on the page. It was really sweet and really kind, but they texted me. They're like, we just had a hard month and we didn't know how we were going to give, but we really wanted to participate in Giving Tuesday. Like they were just like, they were ready. Their hearts were ready, but they didn't functionally know how to do it. And they just shared a testimony with me where they're like, God opened up this special opportunity for my husband that we didn't see coming at all. And so they were able to give, a couple $100. Like, but I thought that was so precious because it was like, it was in their heart.
Right.
They weren't like, this is bonus now. It's December. More gifts for the kids or whatever. They were that's what that is. Like, that's God answering. So I think there's, evidence of prayer. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to teach some of my students in the Psalms. Like, prayer alerts you to look for God in those ways. So for that particular, person who shared that with me, their heart was already there, though their finances were not. That then when an opportunity opened up, they knew what to do with it.
It's a real situation of giving yourself to the Lord first.
Right.
And I think that makes all the difference. Yeah, that's cool. It's a great testimony.
Yeah, I think overall as a church, just trying to come to a place where it isn't reliance on our own strength, or even, hey, end of the month or whatever our like perspective comes down to, like if they can be brought into like what God's doing in our midst, as opposed to like our my individual household, like having a perspective where it's like, we're in this together, it's like God has called us into this venture together. And it's like, we can't arrive because I was able to get my household in order. Now I can do X, Y, Z for my family. It's like, if we can broaden our perspective and seeing like, yeah, you accomplished those individual goals, but like, if your perspective wasn't first of like, I can now participate in what we're doing, but it's like,
Yeah, there's
hey,
not going to
now
be
I
a
can-
point when you arrive. Like,
Yeah.
it's just going to be a choice to obey God's word,
Right.
whether you have a little or whether you have a lot. I don't think
Yeah,
there's
there
a
is
moment.
that,
Once
like,
I get this together, then I'll be a
Real
giver.
wisdom in
That's
Jesus
not,
is like, if you're faithful in little,
Right.
you'll be faithful in much. Like, yeah, people always think, oh, I'm going to get to this place of stability now. I'm just going to be passing out bills like crazy. Not going to happen.
not
Like,
going to happen.
Which faithful
Yeah.
and little, faithful and much comes down to even like looking at the widow and her 2 mites. Like, look how she gives it. She's not. It's the look how you're giving, not look what you're giving. Where
Yeah.
I think you both highlighted on that.
If you
of
can
like,
be a poor student and you're cheerfully giving your $10, that's all you can give that month. That's awesome,
yeah,
And I think if you'll never get to that place where you're just like, oh, this is easy. Now that I'm stable, I will give my resources willingly. Those become the worst givers.
right. Because again, you're not at a place where this is a ritual that you're seeing the light from and that you're like participating in. It's like, I'm going to put that off and I have control on when I enter it and when I don't. Where if everyone's coming, with a free will offering of like, hey, this is the time of year where we examine for good or bad, for like great or, least, we're still
Yeah.
giving.
I do think it's important that people with whatever little they're given, that they're faithful with it. And because as we get older, our bar of what we think security or stability is just keeps going up and up.
Right.
When you're a student, you're like, once I have a stable job and I know my monthly income, then I'll start giving. And then they get that stable income and they're like, well, I have these
But
things.
now I have this
got to
bill
pay
and
off this,
bill, right.
whatever it is. And you never arrive. So just give yourself to the Lord first.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And wherever you're at. And if you can get to the place where on the other end of giving, you actually feel that sense of joy of getting to honor God and participate in what he's doing, with however little that is, it's going to be a really beautiful thing.
I think something you were saying, which we can, wrap up here soon, but it sparked something in me where I think we can have a mentality just naturally as people that are in the world where it feels like the naivety of youth, where it's like, hey, I'm a massively generous giver. I'll give all that I have. And I'm like not accounting for the things in the future. As we get older, I think there's an air of maturity of like, well, I'm going to be more conservative and I'm going to like ration off what we need to think through. And then I'll, give what we can. But it's like kind of like damps down, as we get older. I think that could be the tendency of I need to be more austere with my resources because I know how hard it is to work and to get them. And I think that's something that we don't see in either of these passages where it's like, it's not naive to be like a generous giver. And it's not naive to be a person that puts God first and then, approaches like, how does he want me to give? Like we should be, I think, radically different than the world and not just growing as we age into this place where maturity is equaling, hey, I have systematized and secured a position where I'm not lacking or I'm not needing, and now I can be generous. That it's like throughout, I think from a student till when we're older, like we should be practicing this generosity first. Like, how do I participate in God's kingdom? What is he calling me to give? And then like, how can I participate with those around me? Not just when it's, available to me or when I'm comfortable to do it, but it's like kind of at all times, like having our eyes open, our ears open to like jump in and participate. Do y'all want to finish with anything else? Do y'all want to say anything else?
No, it's good.
I
Well
think I'm
said.
good.
Thank you. Perfect. That was great. Again, I think all these topics can feel really enlightening on Sunday. And then until you like work it out in a conversation, I think it can get dimmer as we like get away from that sermon on that specific day. this podcast is hopefully, Lord willing, a time where you can re-listen. I think get energized to like dig into these texts specifically, and to have a conversation with someone else. Like, hey, like, with your spouse, like, do we have an attitude that's like cheerful and giving? Like, what is our disposition when we are tithing each month or giving to the giving campaign, or like with a roommate? I think this can be like a really challenging opportunity that we can all like give ourselves to, where we're able to exercise what does our faith look like on the day-to-day practically, not just sitting in church on Sunday. So hopefully you all will find a way to chat about this with others. If you haven't subscribed or liked, that genuinely helps. So please subscribe to this channel, give it a like, give it a review even. Who knows? It's all things are possible in what you're able to leave. But this has been the Sermon Podcast. Until next time, we'll see you at church. Bye.
See ya.
See you, everyone.